Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you everybody for checking in online. For some of you, it's been a long day here in the basement, in the room in the central London, an unusually very warm day. I'm Rainer Kattel. I'm a professor here at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. I'm also deputy rector, but I'm here to do a very short, brief introduction because we have a wonderful panel who have way more to say on the topic than I can ever imagine. So I'm here to learn. And that's not it. I'll do a bit more than that. But so the panel focuses on decolonizing public administration. And I think a lot of you might think, well, why do you decolonize there? It's just a public administration is tool, it's mechanism, it's sort of neutral. And anyway, people who go to civil service are told to be neutral. So can we even decolonize something like public administration? And of course, if you look at more closely, you can see that because the state, in many ways, is defined to power and violence and hegemony, which by its very nature, of course, has to exclude somebody. And that exclusion very often happens on the basis of race and gender and so forth. And it is I think the deepest question for this panel is, can you imagine a state without hegemony? Or can be the hegemonic powers of the state benevolent? And can they be decolonized? So hopefully we will start to get an answer to this very fundamental question about our statehood as such. So while there's lots of discussion by some of the panelists around decolonizing economics, we'll hear about that, and decolonizing politics, which is very important. But I think decolonizing public administration is really going to the core of what do we think the state actually is, how does it work, and for whom does it work? So I'm very glad to have with me Nai Kalima, and together with Nai and Julius Mukwaba from a sister department here at UCL, we have a small project that has made some of the workshops that lead into this work possible. And our hope is that this will lead into a broader practice-based theorizing around decolonizing public administration, and hopefully at some point into a textbook. So you're all participating in and giving us your ideas and thoughts. But I will give the floor over to Nai to really kick us off and to introduce the panel and everything else. And she's done all the hard yards. She's been wonderful so far. Thank you so much, Nai.
So hi, everyone. I'm honored. I'm excited to see you all tonight. This took some time to create, and so it's really nice to see everybody here and in person, and to kind of kick things off. So tonight we're going to be hearing from an amazing panel of speakers, and we also have a featured guest speaker, Rohit Chopra, and then we also have Damon, who will be giving a formal introduction to our featured guest speaker. I will start with a brief introduction of who our panelists are, and so we have over a period of about we had 2 days where we had policy hackathon workshops. And so these were almost day long for both of them. And they took place actually earlier last week. And then there was another one this week. And in that, we were interested in thinking about how can we think about decolonizing praxis, how we might explore that in the context of public administration. And so thinking about how we do public administration, what are the ways that we approach that, and how can we perhaps change that? And then also thinking about how can we think about what are the ways in which coloniality, so the legacies of colonialism or colonial dynamics of power, are being replicated through, in turn, public systems, public services, and with implications for public value. And so that was kind of what drove this exploration. And the panel that you see here, the 4 people on the end, these are the people who helped us to engage with that work. And roles, they kind of brought up interesting provocations for us to consider and different lenses to explore it through. And so you'll hear more about that from them, but I'll just share a few pictures. So we had about 40 people gathered together. Yeah, thank you. For workshop 1, we got to hear about thinking about what is decolonizing economics, so thinking about it through the lens of economics. From Rowan, we got to hear about thinking about decolonizing in terms of co-governance, and so we got to hear more about that in the context of New Zealand. And then from myself, I didn't get into it as much, but basically what I I brought up some items, but what I explore is thinking about decolonizing in the context of digital transformation in the public sector. And so looking at kind of the extractive dynamics around that. And then next slide. For workshop 2, this workshop was focused on health AI and well-being, and we did this workshop. We co-organized that with Leo Celli from MIT Critical Data, and it was an honor to kind of have him there along with a lot of other technologists and clinicians as we thought about health AI and its implications. And then alongside that, we also had visiting Professor Keith McGee, who's a visiting professor at UCL IPP, and also explored this question in terms of thinking about decolonizing communities and public systems. And so it was a really dynamic discussion. And then on the end, we also heard from another colleague of mine who's based in Taiwan, who was not here tonight, who looks at kind of these themes in the context of AI governance. And so it was a really, really dynamic session. Next slide. Where we were looking at what does decolonizing praxis in public administration look like? And we wanted to kind of explore that. Next slide. And so we came up with a lot of different ideas and ways to kind of explore that, but thinking about it as something that could refer to what we would do in terms of thinking about public thought, and then also thinking about what would it mean to consider this as a movement. And particularly, it was really interesting that this idea of looking at decolonizing public administration, because decolonizing is already a theme that is looked at a lot, but it's also thought of as something that is very much global. What would it mean to actually look at this in terms of not just the global avenues, but also the local avenues? And so kind of interpreting it in these two ways. Next slide. And so we came together, we had fun, we had Post-its, and we were trying to engage with this public value canvas, but we wanted to critically deepen it by engaging with decolonial perspectives and decolonizing praxis in terms of how we engaged in the work and how we thought about others engaging in this work across public administrations. Next slide. And so they had interesting discussions. We have some of them here tonight, which is awesome. And we spent some time thinking about that, going through that. And as a part of what would kind of prompt those discussions is prior to coming to the workshop, people were asked to bring in some sort of either a news story or a personal story, but basically thinking about how can we explore this lens in a contextually grounded manner as it relates either to our own lives or to the lives of people around us. And so we hope to try and ground the discussion to really kind of bring together the theory and the practical. Next slide. And so on day 2, we also had more of this health AI focused workshop. And so this is where we were looking at what does it mean to look at health AI in terms of what it means for people's well-being across public health systems, and then also questions around in terms of the technologies that are being developed, to what extent are the benefits that are being developed around that actually coming back to the communities that are providing some of the data as a critical resource. And so there we had people kind of showcase what they did. People had interesting conversations. We spent the day together. Next slide. And this was just the beginning point. And so tonight we're going to hear from several of the people who were fundamental and a big part of making that work possible. And how can governments build safer, more trustworthy, and equity-centered public administrations with decolonizing praxis? And so really thinking about the way that we do things. Next slide. And that's it. And so with that, let me introduce our fantastic panel and get started. So first from the panel, we'll be hearing from Reverend Dr. Professor Keith McGee, Professor of Cultural and Justice at UCL IPP, and Chair and Professor of Practice in Social Justice at Newcastle Law School at Newcastle University. Next, we'll be hearing from Associate Professor Carolina Alves, Associate Professor of Economics at UCL IPP. And then next, we'll be hearing from visiting Professor Rowan Conway, Visiting Professor of Strategic Design at UCL IPP, and Deputy Director of the Just Transition Finance Lab at the London School of Economics, and founder of Transformation by Design. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Dr. Leo Anthony Celli, who is a senior research scientist and PI for critical data at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, and practicing ICU physician at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. And so please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you, Nai. Can you all hear me all right? Yeah. Wonderful. So I sit in all of these interesting spaces, but ultimately as a practitioner, deeply embedded in the lived tension of power, safety, and justice. I've spoken mostly in this space based upon my work with the Black Community Policing Advisory Panel, which is aligned with the London Metropolitan Police. And that places me at the intersection of governance, technology, and community trauma, where decolonizing praxis cannot be theoretical, but I argue that it must be lived. When we speak of decolonizing public administration, we must confront the ways in which governance infrastructures replicate colonial logics, and how we must look at extraction, surveillance, classification, and control, whether in policing, healthcare, finance, or urban planning. These systems, tools often reproduce the very harms they were meant to remedy. Take the example of AI-driven predictive policing and facial recognition technologies. My colleagues and I scrutinize this. These tools, dressed up in neutrality of algorithms, reinforce historic patterns of racial targeting, turning vulnerability into suspicion, and place entire communities under constant digital scrutiny, without consent, without recourse, and without healing. So what does decolonizing public governance require in community and public spaces? It requires shifting from theory and practice around the questions of who redefines risk, who produces knowledge, and who owns the data. We need to move from expert-driven systems to community co-produced governance. This is where practice becomes critical. In our work with the Metropolitan Police Service, we propose citizen science models as acts of decolonizing resistance, training communities to gather data, having the ability to audit police actions, and to generate alternative evidence to challenges within institutional narratives. Not just collecting grievances, but systematically producing counter data that emerges from lived realities rather than bureaucratic abstractions. Secondly, we insist on trauma-informed governance. Colonial structures have long inflicted collective trauma, especially on Black, Indigenous, and marginalized populations. But true decolonizing practice centers on healing, not only institutional reform, but relational repair. And third, we call for an interdisciplinary co-design where artists and theologians, economists and data scientists, social campaigners and academics sit at the same table in the same room. This is not merely inclusion. We argue that it is about reconstituting governance as a shared act of meaning making. This approach aligns with what we believe, I think, as we sit here in this space about reimagining the state as a dynamic creator of public values that places collective well-being, citizen participation, and systematic injustice at the core of innovation itself. So I'll stop there.
I'm going to bring to the table a little bit of this discussion related to economics, which somehow take us back to what Rainer had said before, how we challenge the neutrality, or not how we challenge, but this idea that some tools we use in policymaking and economics, they can be neutral, they can be objective, they can be universal. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. And I think it's worth mentioning before I start how I got to that discussion of decolonization in economics, which is not something that is, let's say, mainstream or something that is out there for our students to have contact with. And a lot of that has to do when I came to the UK to do my PhD, having been most of my education, my higher education was in Brazil, and kind of have faced face a wall regarding the theories, the approaches I was used to. And from comments, and that is the progressive circle. So I don't know how many of you are from the UK, but I did my PhD at SOAS, which is, I don't think you can get more radical than SOAS as far as universities goes in the UK. So even in this progressive circle, I came across comments, this theory, I never heard about it. Is someone from the Global South wasn't that fashionable at the time. Is someone from Brazil? I haven't heard. If this person doesn't publish in English, it probably is not good. And then I met colleagues in conferences and workshops that are facing the same kind of obstacles, but in different continents. I had a friend in the New School of Economics, New York, facing the same resistance. I had a friend actually in a university in India also suffering the same thing. And we started kind of wondering, what is that when you're bringing an author that the perspective is not one that's more traditional or acceptable, if it's one that's theorizing from the perspective, from a different standing point for the perspective of the periphery or global south, why there is this resistance. And that's what took us, this is a group of friends, colleagues, looking to this decolonization of economics. So this is the beginning, and we came across two aspects. One is in the 70s when many social sciences, they start looking to post-colonial theory, economics managed to kind of shield itself. And we started wondering what that was, why that happened. And a lot has to do, it took us to think how economics, in the way that it was officially born, the Adam Smith, the father of economics, it takes us to how we are conceptualizing and thinking about capitalism. Right, so this is when economics as a discipline becomes formalized, or at least start existing and then formalized to Cambridge, UK, with Marshall. So this for us was very telling, an idea that, what is capitalism, or how the economics was very linked to these liberal values, to understand what was happening in terms of generation of wealth, creation of wealth, and also linked to the Enlightenment values. And then the more we digged in, and then we start kind of questioning these values from the Enlightenment that was based in racial hierarchy. It was an Enlightenment for a very specific type of man, the white man. And I think that's when we start really questioning that the problem was actually more complicated than we thought. It was not just an issue that people didn't like theory from the global South, but much more about what is considered knowledge and where knowledge is produced. And that led us to, start investigating that from a more academic perspective. And that's the next point I want to make. What we start thinking is that most of the theories in social sciences and in economics as well, they have this Eurocentrism kind of perspective. They are Eurocentric. And that is not it's not a geographical definition, right? It's not because they're in Europe. It's much more than that. It's the idea, the idea is we see modernity, we see progress from the perspective of what happened in Europe, right? Especially after the Industrial Revolution in England. So basically, the history of humanity becomes a history of remove these obstacles, and then all of us, all the countries around the world would then achieve that progress. That's history of humanity. In a way, there's naturalization of capitalism. We don't, particularly in economics, there isn't a discussion on the violence that came together with the emergence of capitalism. There isn't a discussion of the gender oppression and so on. And what we see in the literature is when we start coming across with a very a dichotomy in the field, right? So, for example, the easy one to go through is that the underdeveloped and then developed, the third world and the first word. And even in different aspects, if you think about how the rational agent should behave, the rationalization of the knowledge, of the information, all this is associated with the male aspect, and the female is the weak. So we start seeing all this dichotomy in terms of category in that context of Eurocentric theory, which is a theory that naturalized, or Eurocentric theories, they naturalize what capitalism is. They obscure or hide or ignore all the racial hierarchy behind these theories, or the question of violence. Of course, the transatlantic slave trade is seen as like an accident, not part of that, that emergence of capitalism. So this is so that's when we really found our enemy, which was this Eurocentric approach, where the rest of the world are always trying to imitate in what's happening in the global north. And not only, right, there is this idea that can be achieved, and there is also the idea that in order that to be achieved, we don't need to discuss any kind of systemic oppression in society, from racial to gender to any income. So this is this investigation for us kind of then led us to and that's the last point I'm making, to challenge that aspect that economics, since political economy, since Adam Smith, into now this formalization of economics where everything becomes more quantified. I don't know how many economists in have in the room, but it's all about modeling, it's all about precision, it's all about being objective, it's all about one solution can be applied in different parts of the world, it's fine. So we start challenging that neutralization, that neutrality, that universality is actually extremely value-laden in terms of what the perspective we should take. And that perspective very often see the rest of the world or words that are still to catch up, in a very different light. So this is where the decolonization of economics now is getting to our discussion, or at least we are pushing that in a discipline more and more. It's not an easy discussion because economists, they really like to think they're neutral, they don't have a positionality, they need precision. So basically the discussion of decolonization economics implies that we have to consider that economics is political, is ideological, and I don't think that's the problem. The problem is when these cards are not on the table, and then we argue that we are neutral when you're not being neutral. So decolonization in economics has, if I could summarize for us, there is no formula. We don't have a final, a guideline, but we do think that the start of that discussion has to be in terms of looking into economic theories and challenge this Eurocentrism. What kind of knowledge is valid and why? And even the possibility of this, the modernization, the development, is that if you have a different perspective, right? If you start theorizing from the perspective of the Global South, like structuralist independency theorists they did, maybe that's not even achievable. So this is where we are right now. So thank you.
It's difficult to follow, especially difficult to follow being an English, white, cis woman in her 50s, sitting in the colonial mothership in the estate of the British Museum, and not to be kind of reflecting on what does that mean there and who am I? And I think I appreciate your ending with positionality, because effectively that's where I start. Who am I and why am I sitting on this panel? And who am I to talk about hegemony? I play 3 different roles, all of which ask me to continuously ask myself about my positionality and my appropriateness to be in the room. And whether or not I bring value to that conversation, whether this is a critical reflection on my own positionality that means that I need to go away and decolonize my own practice, for my personal praxis or my micro experimentation, or actually should I just leave? And in many instances in many instances it is appropriate to leave. And I do actually try and school my students in this at IOPP that there are places where you shouldn't be. You don't have to be you don't have to come in as a strategic designer and think that you're the right person to do the project. But I have 3 different roles. I play a role as a bridge at the LSE between the concept of just transition in a very global context and the financial system, so working with global finance. That's a really, really, really long bridge. It's like the longest bridge in the world. And it asks for an enormous amount of critical and continuous critical reflection about what do we need to think about right now so that we can actually have some kind of shared logic in this room where we can even start the conversation. Because I think it's is underappreciated how cognitively challenging it is to do this work and how confronting it is to do this work as a cis white person in their over 50s. And actually, which might take people to a sense of personal it's a personal deconstruction from a positionality like my own. It's a personal deconstruction of, is my life's work actually good? It's confronting. And to be able to confront yourself like that is a psychological challenge in its own right. So what do I teach? And so I facilitate these conversations, and they're always very chunky. I also teach here, and I teach a program called Transformation by Design, which is where we try and bring, if you like, the applied. I mean, Carolina teaches a whole program on rethinking economic paradigms, and we start to try and teach people applied methods by which you might have some of these conversations. We have 2 sessions on participatory scaffolding, but we start our group work thinking about, and we try to bring in not just a human-centered design process, but a sort of critical pedagogy around the application of design methods to actually do this kind of work, whether this kind of work is working on grand challenges or mission-oriented innovation, or if it's trying to think about how you might do some kind of collective group work around transformation or decolonization. How do you do this work? We start with thinking about different lenses, like an emancipatory design thinking lens takes a very different frame. We use the work of Leslie Ann Knoll to think about a positionality wheel. You start with yourself, but you also start with yourself in communication with the group that you're in. This gives you a sort of reflexive mirror to understand your positionality and appropriateness to take on a challenge. In many of the sort of challenge-based innovation stuff, you might have a big challenge like, well, there, you can take some of this plastic-free ocean. That seems relatively neutral in its own right as a conceptual. It's a challenge, we should try and fix it. But how do we then approach that problem? That's where the positionality frame is really important, because what do you mean, which ocean? What do you mean, which production systems? What do you mean in terms of marine life? What are you preserving? What are you not preserving? It's very overwhelming as you start doing the sort of systemic analysis of these problems, and you then have to break them down into choices of places that you're actually going to engage in the system. And these are the kinds of critical emancipatory design practices we try and teach. They're not just dynamic capabilities. They require certain things like the building of participatory scaffolding. And we have 2 sessions on participatory scaffolding, which starts to talk about the kinds of, I would call Keith an advanced social practitioner, capable of talking. You talked about kind of transdisciplinary groups coming together to really reimagine what democracy is. You have to have done a lot of work together and have a sort of social foundation of psychological safety and trust before you can even start that conversation, unless you're just really happy making hot takes in rooms with people you don't know, which I might be. But that sort of being able to have the social cognition, and this is my 3rd hat that I wear, which is I'm completing my PhD, Bryna, I promise, in psychology and adult social cognition, which is actually looking at what it takes to mentalize, what it takes to empathize with these large major problems. The title of my PhD is now The Boundaries of Economic Cognition, recognizing that we talk about these new economic paradigms, but actually when you try and get people to to think in that space. It's asking them to almost like take off their own skin, because these things are embedded in us, not just in our formative learning practices, but if you have done economics, then you will have been immersed in the sheep dip that is neoclassical economics. If you are not an economist, you will be around it. It will be all around you. It's the water you swim in, you don't understand it. And you go, why do we make these stupid choices? And why are they talking about economic growth when everyone's going, please focus on like things we care about? And actually, they can't, because it's embedded fundamentally in the praxis of new public management. So I do a lot of work working with public practitioners on building their capacity for chunky conversations. I worked with the European Commission last year on the mutual learning exercise on the EU missions, and we had 16 member states and focusing on how do you do citizen participation well. You know, citizen participation should be a decolonizing practice. It should be a practice of empathy, a practice of social listening. But what I work with them with is this game called Citizen Participation Hell No, which is a card game of 50 reasons why you absolutely don't want to do it at all. And it's a really important initiation practice in which you go through the reasons why it is not, and I love both motherhood and apple pie, but it's not motherhood and apple pie talking to people. It's challenging. And when you talk about trauma-informed design, that is 10 years worth of education before you should even walk through the door to start unlocking some of the trauma-informed practices to enable people to really bring to the table the traumas that they may have suffered in their experiences that you're trying to fix for. And I think sometimes with design practices, we think if we know how to do an empathy canvas, we can quickly get to the hot take of, oh, well, I understand this persona and their trauma is embedded in this way. And we should never do that. It is a process of continuous dialogue. So I have been doing a lot of, so my PhD is located in Aotearoa in New Zealand. Why? The whole completely opposite side of the world. But I work very closely with people in New Zealand, Michelle Pawson and Shamabil Akub, and a variety of people from the Ngaitahu tribe who have been really helping me in understanding, and Sasha McMeeking, I should make sure she sees that for the video, really helping me understand this kind of alternative ways of thinking about value, governance, and stewardship, and what it is to continuously co-create together social purpose. So I think from this, the question I think I was asked was, how do you decolonize governance? I think that's a very big question. From my experience, it's all about context and the way of thinking about how you bring relational practice and rehumanizing practices. There are appropriate practices for the places that you're in. So I think I can read from what they had sent me, some of the kind of fundamental differences from the economic perspective, looking at the indigenous worldview coming from Aotearoa, which was recognizing that, thinking about economics from their perspective is taking a balance sheet approach to the economy, so span time and space, where everything past, present, and future must also be accounted for, not just an orthodox profit and loss approach, which just counts the present transactions and excludes unpaid activities or negative externalities. Thinking about time horizon and future generations, a worldview that explicitly does not discount the future. Actions that today are evaluated on their impact for future generations, with the responsibility to look from 100 years out rather than standing today and looking forward. This fundamentally challenges conventional economic tools like discount rates. Collective and individual focus, how they work together. Prioritizing collective benefit that enables individual success, but it doesn't assume collective benefit is simply the sum of individual successes. It's it's understanding that we are together. Collectivity spans both space, community, and time, ancestors and descendants. And stewardship and ownership. Economic outcomes derive from the use and stewardship of lands. And this is far beyond the economic value that a balance sheet would say. So I think how we understand how to work with new practices requires that there is, and Rainer asked the question, can you imagine a state without hegemony? I think it's hard to imagine a state without it being an authorizing environment. And certainly you need an authorizing environment that wants to enable these continuous discussions. It's very hard right now when you're doing this work in the US when actually the environment is not working with you. You know, you may say you want no kings, but, you know, what have you actually got in the US? I'm saying to general people in the Americas. So, you know, I think the final thing I would say in terms of, you know, what does this mean for praxis, is that there is no single way, that we have to think about, you know, when we think about things like just transition, we can't, you know, I'm often asked, can you give it to me in, you know, 3 bullet points? We can't do that. What you have to think about is justice is always co-created, negotiated, and we always have to think about who are we considering when we consider justice. And so really the future, while actually the promise of AI is that we will be able to cognitively offload, the real talent that we're going to have to nurture is the ability to be together, which is actually cognitively very weighty. You know, we have to actually think more rather than think less about each other. So that's where I come from.
Okay, what you're gonna hear next is really meant to scare you, and I hope you get scared. We're in a very different world now. AI is being shoehorned into very broken systems. And I would give you 5 reasons why you should be concerned. So generative AI is in the air that we breathe. It's no longer research. It's no longer optional. And if everyone does not have some basic understanding of AI, I think we're heading in the wrong direction. The first thing that you learn about AI is what we refer to as sycophancy bias. So it is designed to goad your ego. It is designed to make you addicted. It is not going to antagonize you by giving you opinions and perspectives that are against your worldview. The worst part is that you see AI as an oracle. So it's social media on steroids. Whereas in social media, you think that you're just interfacing with your peers. Here, you think you're talking to the oracle that has access to all the knowledge in the world. And for that reason, they carry a heavy weight when they give you some suggestions. And then, of course, AI is trained on human data. There's a circular fallacy logic to think that humans in the loop will save us. No. How could we humans, with all our implicit and explicit biases, be able to tell us if AI is giving us a biased prediction or classification? That's just stupid, right? And then there's the black box. Explainable AI is a myth. Please don't say that we have explainable AI. You're just reinforcing your biases. Because AI consists of layers and layers of representation. To fool us to say that, oh, it's because of this and that, again, you are just reinforcing your biases. And of course, the worst is the not pertaining to AI itself, but pertaining to society, the techno-optimism. So what I would like you to really take away from tonight is that any system that cannot be fixed without AI cannot be fixed with AI. And then the last part is, I'm gonna keep this short because I'm interested to hear other people. I'm gonna push back a little bit on the word co-design and co-create. Because in the real world, it doesn't happen. We invite them to the table and yet we order the food for them because we think that they won't understand the menu. We're footing the bill. So power structures exist everywhere, even with an intention of co-designing and co-creation. I love the saying in that line from Conclave, certainty is the enemy of unity. Hubris is the enemy of the good. It's not perfection. I keep saying that every time we start any event, we leave our hubris at the doorstep because it's ultimately the obstacle in any innovation to deliver its promise. And I don't have the answers, but I do know that the only ingredient that is needed to be able to address all these problems is to truly bring diverse voices, and you bring them in, not just for the sake of bringing them in. And this is where we struggle, is how much agency do they need to be able to engage with us in a level playing field? Because we bring them in, oh, they have lived experiences, that's their contribution. And we have the technical expertise. And you know that in the world, the technical expertise always overshadows the lived experiences. So again, we're being reductive, I think, to believe that we have all the solutions now. The solutions are not gonna come from UCL or MIT or Harvard. The solutions are gonna come from the world around us. We'd like to think that we're smarter than the rest of the world. We're not. We're smarter in that we've used the world to get us to where we are. So somehow we need to acknowledge that, otherwise we're not gonna solve any problem.
So from our amazing panel, we have some amazing openings. We're going to go through another round, and this time I'm going to hear from each of you. What would be your call to action for the people here in this room and even beyond, maybe some of the people viewing and in the world, as it relates to kind of the prompt?
Well, if I could respond to co-creation first, I will say to you what we're doing with the Black Community Policing Advisory Panel with the London Metropolitan Police, it counters your argument. When we began to talk about creating a citizen science model, they asked us from the panel, which was made up of academics that they brought together to discuss the Baroness report and to write another report, and we refused to write another report. But we said, what were your implementation tools to the reports that you've already done? That's what got us into this space. And so as we began to talk about creating a citizen science model, they said, would you lay out for us what that looks like? And we said no, because we need all the co-creators in the room in order to design what it would look like. So we start from the place of saying, if everyone is not in the room to create the program, there is no program. So we take a counter narrative to that. So I think it does not happen in every space, but it's certainly, I've been insistent upon it happening with the Black community policing. I would say, as far as a call to action, that if we are serious about decolonizing public governance, that we must move beyond reforming broken systems to fundamentally reimagining how knowledge is captured, who holds that knowledge, as we've discussed, who holds power, and who holds care. Now, you have to remember that I am the Reverend Doctor, all the rest of these titles, right? But we have to build institutions that do not extract from communities, but are accountable to communities. And we have to shift governance from an architecture of control to an ecology of healing. And I would say to you that decolonizing is not an intellectual exercise, it's a moral one. It demands that we shift from the comfort of authority to the discomfort of accountability. And that we unlearn governance as control and relearn it as an act of care. The work before us, I think, is profound, and the moment is urgent and critical because of what is happening in all of these spaces. But I think it's one that calls us all to task, and that we in this space and outside of this space have a collective accountability of what we do together to bring about the change that's necessary.
Thank you. Sorry, Nai, but I also have to follow on this. I think, this is so important, because when I start doing that, kind of going through the discussion of decolonization in academia, I remember one of the first time I presented that discussion was actually for a Brazilian audience. I shouldn't have done that. And in the audience, we had many people who are involved with what we call the quilombolas in Brazil. I don't know how many that you are familiar with that, but there are communities that, you know, they're fighting racism and inequality in Brazil. And it's quilombola because it refers to a place, was the place where when you're a slave and you're running away, that you'd create this community. I think it has different name in the Caribbean and so on. And, you know, just to cut the story short, they just torn me apart. Like, well, I'll go to the university and do the decolonization because we are here every day fighting that. And that was the same when I was in a panel with discussion development with 2 development economists from Caribbean who told me, you know, decolonization is to be every day on the street fighting for reparations, and not to be like decolonization is like a talk for global North universities. And that has been with me since then, and that's why I think you're right. I think these interventions were right of what is this discussion and why it's necessary and how we can be inclusive and how co-creation could mean something. And I think I've been still debating these points, but or at least that's what I tell me when I go to sleep, and also when I have to publish articles, sadly, I think there is a question of the role I can play on this, right? I think there is, when you talk about the coloniality, which by the way is a word that I learned with this Brazilian audience, because I just say the colonization is like, what's the difference? Then I start, which has to do how we deal with the legacies that modern society they have from slave trade, from racial hierarchy, and a lot of this has to do with, you know, some of them have come across with how we decolonize our methodology, our epistemologies, and so on, which is how we understand the world, how we're trying to move away from that hierarchy, how we look to different perspectives, to different standing points that is not just the global North and developed countries. And I feel that that's my function now. And I think to bring the discussion of decolonization for a discipline that is extremely, the sociology of the discipline is basically white men, and the discussion of the discipline itself, the content, is one that doesn't really consider inequalities or any systematic forms of oppression. So I think this is part of what one can do, but I want to bring to that something I learned with Robertel Pale. She's at LSE, when she said how we navigate the white gaze, and being in global North universities, that's such privilege to be here, and how we protect it from so many so many attacks one can have been vocal. And she was highlighting how we have to be in contact with what's happening out there and give voices platform. And that's like your role, having these walls of UCL or Cambridge and so on, is how you bring people here and give them platform. And I don't know if that's enough, if that's what I tell me to sleep well, but I think this is a part of what I can do as an extremely academic economist that have been changing a lot since I got IPP and have to share my time with these people who, want to convince me that practice is important. So I think in terms of what we can do, I think is related to that. I think we can't have this decoloniality and trying to have a different perspective of reality or how we theorize the world without being listening what's out there. I want to just to give example, which goes back to what Ron was saying. As economists look into development in Latin America, of course, the context of climate change, and I was full on that discussion of a green industrial policy, not the Mariana one, the Mariana is fine, but like what's happening, and there was this push in Brazil to have wind farms, right? That kind of the eco-friendly forms of energy, and I was full on there until I started looking. Okay, maybe I should look into what people who are in these places are saying, and I wouldn't have that attempt as economist if I hadn't come across a discussion of decolonization and so on. And what I realized actually, which is super counterintuitive, is that people from the community, indigenous people, they actually have a movement that is called Movement Against the Renewables, right, which is getting stronger. It may be another landless movement like the we have in Brazil since the 80s, because these wind farms means that they are displaced. from the way to produce. They can. So the thing is, we can see that fight of climate change in a way, yes. And then we go and talk to this community and say like, no, we're just against. I couldn't care less about the wind farm, because I just don't have means to live anymore after that. So I think this is an important aspect in terms of how in this ivory tower, in a very cozy place, we give voices to people who don't have that protection, but also make, understand their conditions and so on. Yeah. Sorry, I was mea culpa, I guess, but yeah.
No, thank you very much. How do you close? I mean, it's interesting sitting between the kind of idea of land use challenges and then, what did you say, a sycophancy bias, and where to start between those things. I think I see and feel the kind of extraordinary rapid pace threat of AI, and I think we fundamentally as educators need to be really on it as well. I teach design thinking also at the School of Management, and one student group this year did an analysis of essay writing with GPT, and they did a little micro survey to UCL students, their mates, and came up with this, terrifying statistic of, 2 years ago, something like 25% of people were using AI to write essays, and now 95% of the cohort were using AI to write essays. I see it. I look at essays and I know exactly where they've come from. And this is something where we're seeing a fundamental transformation of practice. And I think, I've always thought of it as cognitive offloading, and the sycophancy bias is really terrifying, because when we become obsessed with our phones as our best friend, do we even care about land use transitions? Yeah. Do we even care about Indigenous people's rights and free and informed consent? You end up with this academic discourse actually about decolonisation, and then a practice in which everyone's talking to their bestie phone and listening in awe as they are an oracle. And what does that do to the 100-year head start that the petrochemical industry has had in terms of our energy systems? Where ultimately we are embedded in systems that will, I don't want to be super depressing, but, systems that are the, causal link to climate change, which are now getting considerably more, rampantly used and then pushed back on because of things like, clean energy not being appropriate in its land use. So we're at real crunch points with what I think was, until really quite recently, conceptual transitions. We could talk about a just and fair transition to net zero, decarbonisation journeys, because they were still somewhat conceptual in the future. But now we're talking about, rapid decision making about critical minerals and new mining, and what does that mean to the, to Indigenous peoples who are being asked to make decisions, at speed about, primary industries in their country. Look at Argentina; it's just completely reprimarized. So industrial policy is regressing at a time that we're talking about decolonisation and having more complex conversations. So we have to acknowledge the challenging world we live in, and the rampant pace at which AI is then getting everyone's attention. So it's an interesting time to try and have complex conversations. I leave it at that. I try and help people do that.
Okay, it's the provocative person again. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. There is. And amidst this chaos, we need to be able to harness the energy. So how do we do that? So the task that we have been trying to address is engaging the young people to reimagine the world. So how would the system of education might look like with a very powerful technology? How would the system of innovation, system of governance, system of regulation? We need to start with a clean slate. We can't be constrained by our worldview right now. And this is why we bring in high school students, grade school students to come in with us. We were at an event with inner city high school students, and we asked them, how do you teach high school algebra with AI? And of course, when we ask the teachers that, no one can give us an answer because they're not familiar with the technology. So this is the time to truly walk the talk. And again, there will be no stupid suggestions. Create that psychological safety space where everyone could challenge each other. Don't be afraid to be the dumbest in the room. When you're the dumbest in the room, that means you're gonna learn the most. So now I actually am very embracing when I don't understand a lot of what people are saying, because to me that's a challenge, and how can I meet people halfway? So we are at this precipice. I think that this is truly an enlightenment period. And I'm gonna quote an Indian philosopher that said that enlightenment is when you transition from being a somebody to being a nobody, and then from being a nobody to being an everybody. So how do we operationalize that in our day-to-day lives?
Thank you to our fantastic panel. Next, we're going to have Damon. So Damon is a visiting professor of labor innovation, labor markets and innovation. And we'll have him take it away.
All right. Thank you, Nai. I've been given the great honor of introducing my friend Rohit Chopra, who's going to be sort of the keynote for this panel. And I've been thinking about how to do this in the context of the decolonizing public administration. And so here's what I'm going to say about Rohit, and it may seem like a weird way to introduce him, because I'm going to begin by talking about what a colonizing public institution is. All right, think about it, right? Like, this conversation really begins with the question of, we are decolonizing public institutions. What does a colonizing one look like? So just to frame you, just get you in the frame, the British Navy, 1890, right? That's a colonizing public institution, right? Now, we don't live in 1890, but in 2009, so now Rohit's, I can see Rohit is following where I'm going. In 2009, I think it's fair to say that if you understand the deep history of the United States, that our public institutions that dealt with the financial system were, if not colonizing institutions, in the business of perpetuating the legacy of colonialism. And by that I mean that the fundamental legacy of colonialism is in capital. It's in who has capital and who does not. Right? Look at what the sources are of the great wealthy families of the countries that engaged in colonialism, and you will find that they are colonial. Now, if you're in the business of making sure that whatever happens, that the stockholders of the large banks are protected, you're engaging in a perpetuation of colonialism. And that's fundamentally what our institutions were doing in 2008 and 2009. If you're in the business of kind of making excuses for monopoly power, you're also in that business, right? Now, Rohit has been in the business of dismantling that approach to public administration in the United States for a long time. I'm not quite sure when he started. He graduated from the same place I did as an undergraduate in 2004. Rumor has it that even then he was in that business. But the big-time way in which Rohit has been in that business was first as a commissioner of the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, which deals with issues of consumer protection and monopoly power. And then as first the deputy director and then the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was an institution created to challenge it was created in the Dodd-Frank Act to challenge the focus of financial regulators on protecting finance and moving them toward thinking about the public, right? And you got to understand that against the context of the fact that the racial wealth gap in the United States, which has something to do with colonialism, the racial wealth gap in the United States in 2009, after the financial crisis, was this. Median household income for African American families, $7,000, right? Less than the value of a used car. Median household wealth for white families, $120,000. Against that context, Rohit here used an institution designed, in a sense, to do something about it, and really made it work. Really made it work, which might have something to do with why President Trump fired him. So I give you somebody who is in the business of decolonizing public administration, my friend Rohit Chopra.
Well, thank you all for being here, and really thanks to my friend Nye for organizing this. I think actually let's reflect a little bit on what we just heard, in some ways a bit of a debate about the extent to which you can use process, and I don't want to be too reductive about it, but how do you change the upfront so that the outcomes later work better? And I actually do think that's really important. But I will say this, there was one word that I think was super important that several of you said, which was accountability. And I just want to be honest, in the US, we have had a system of a no accountability culture for those who have a lot of power and continue to misuse and abuse it. It is often in the form of corporate power. It is not necessarily individuals. It is inanimate things, legal constructions and technological constructions. And I think where I would push us all to think hard about is what can we do to design process so that those who are truly living paycheck to paycheck, those who don't have the bandwidth in their minds to even participate in the things we would aspire that everyone has the ability to participate in. So we got to really wrestle with that tension. I think we were really thinking about very discrete set of problems. Damon mentioned actually wealth gap. That is very much not only the result of a financial crisis, but also a very recent history in the United States of redlining, the idea that people who fought in World War II were going to get essentially free college education, except if you were African American. The ability to get an accessible home mortgage, which in the US has been such a dramatic way of wealth creation, it was really the neighborhoods that did not have high African American populations who could participate in that. And over time, it's compound interest. The gaps grow and grow and grow. And now it's the digital era. I don't know how it works in the United Kingdom, but as part of the mortgage process in the US, you are required to get an appraisal, a third-party look at how much is that property worth. And what we uncovered was systematically the appraisal was not based on how many bedrooms or how many bathrooms. It was partially determined by the photos above your fireplace, the looks of people in your family, so much so that people hid their pictures, hid their diplomas from historically black colleges and universities, and hid any marker that they were somebody who might have been penalized on that. We tried to really think about what was the ways to solve it, and here's what we heard. Don't worry, soon the machines are going to do it. The algorithms will take the bias out of the equation, And I think that was a really vexing question of what is the way to solve that? And I'm really worried that in Europe and a lot of jurisdictions, there is a temptation to do a lot of process, auditing, testing, and all sorts of paperwork that I'm sure you can hire someone to say it's all good. But maybe we should be thinking about what Damon said, the business incentives, the liability, and who is accountable for when things go wrong. So here's what we did. We put into place new regulations that made those developers accountable when their algorithm discriminated, made those lenders accountable under the law if they used artificial intelligence that broke the law. And there was no more tolerance for blaming the robot when you hired the robot. And that's what I'm actually think we got to be really, really worried about is we think that because of advances in technology, we have to create all new regulatory structures for it. And there's some places where we do. But sometimes maybe we need to just enforce the law on the books. Under US law and under a lot of law in the UK and the European continent, it basically says if you deny someone for a loan, you got to explain the reasons why. Well, you can't say the reason why is the algorithm says so. Once you do that, you create the ability for someone to outsource liability, outsource the process to someone else that can't do anything about it. I feel like, I don't know if this is true of airlines here. We have an issue now with our US airlines where you go to the gate agent and they can solve nothing. And actually they say, I'm just sorry, you're going to have to call the toll-free phone number or you're going to have to talk to the chat bot. And what it is a game of passing the accountability buck. And it almost creates a situation where the customer who experiences the harm, they empathize with the gate agent because they see the person they're interacting with also has no power in the situation. But that's a way the process is designed. So what do we do to set the legal accountability mechanisms? I really think we have to think hard to make sure our laws are putting responsibility on the individuals and firms that are choosing to use these systems, whether it's in the context of technology for facial recognition and policing, whether it's in the context of automated decision-making for education and health. I really think if people up front know that they may be on the hook, that would make a big difference. We saw that, in the US, tobacco companies, they knew that some of this was going to be badly addictive, and they thought that they could push that on the public. And I think many of these large technology firms know that their business model is based on surveillance and creating addictive technologies. And I think they should be held liable for that too, because that is the only way that we will recalibrate the business incentives. And like Damon said, it really is all about the money. And if we can think about those corporate business incentives, I think that we will make some real progress. And it's not to say we shouldn't have good process. We shouldn't include people's voices. And one of the things I love to do as an agency head is every single place to be able to sit and have members of the public yell at you. And I think you need to be shamed sometimes because it can be easy for government officials to just listen to the special interests, but not actually to the people affected. So I hope that you think through, what do we need to change in terms of process? What do we need to change in terms of laws? but what are the laws that we have on the books that we can use to get collective redress on a lot of these really big problems? So thanks, Nai.
Thank you so much, Rohit. That was fantastic. And I think we should have a lot of questions. So right now, we're going to take a couple questions in the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. A person with the mic will come to you. And when you ask your question, make sure that you stand up, tell us your name, where you're from, and that your question ends in a question mark. So.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. My name is Halldóra. I'm from Iceland. I've actually just come out of Parliament. I've been there for 8 years. So this, all of this has been amazing, listening to all of you speak. My biggest worry is it always comes down to incentives at the end of the day. And it also comes down to, my question, I guess, so I don't start ranting, is, how do we accomplish this without changing the root incentives in our system, which is our economy, which is our ideology, how we think about the world, and how we approach, because all of these ideas, the people I've worked with in Parliament, we're kind of molded by this way of thinking very compartmentally. Like our whole education system is molded around that idea. And the actual understanding that how different systems affect each other and how decisions here affect decisions made over there, this holistic view of governing is so missing from people's, the concept of it doesn't even exist. So how do we shift that so that the people who actually are the ones making the decisions, I don't think that they should be. I don't think that we actually have a real democracy. That's my other question. What does a real democracy look like? Because I don't think we've discovered it yet. So what does that look like? These are big questions. And there were some question marks, but thank you for...
Hi, thank you so much for that. I'm Anaya, I'm 16 and I just had come from school today. This is mainly targeted at Dr. Chopra, but I think it's quite relevant to everything that you guys had talked about. But you mentioned the importance of government officials and administrations in listening to those affected by their decisions. And I feel like if you look at the US government and the Trump administration right now, I think we see quite the opposite of that. And we see a lot of ignorance of the perspectives of the people who are quite directly affected by those decisions. How do you think that's going to pose an issue to rethink public governance? And can there be any progress made with a government that is quite stubborn in its beliefs and values? Thank you.
So I think actually, I'll just speak personally. I think since COVID, so many of us feel very fatigued by really the way the world is working. I think it's a mixture of that sense that the government and the social order is not working for people. There's a sense of that the normal institutions to solve problems have not been solving problems. I think the trust level in those institutions is so low that, including, by the way, universities, including others, in some ways that it's more of a forcing mechanism for rethinking a lot of it. And I really worry that you ask about, the current administration in the US, I'm actually really worried that the answer to that will be just to revert to what was done, but we thought was okay, when in reality, it's been broken for a while. And so I think as you approach, I think, these next few days, I don't want you thinking about rebooting. I want us to think about really reimagining and reconstructing. And I think part of it is we know that people who, we're not all these rational actors. We don't have all the information about how policies are affecting us. But at the same time, I can, we have a bunch of Americans on this panel. We at least know that organizing in social movements and public opinion are a huge political force. I think even a 16-year-old lived during the Arab Spring, lived during moments where public opinion toppled powerful people. So I think there's ways in which we got to reimagine, and we have to assume a little bit that there is going to be harm, but rather than just kind of reconstructing what existed, let's really kind of create something new. So I think that is really the challenge of the next few days. I could go on and on about this theme, but let's not recreate something that we know didn't really work, whether it's financial regulators, whether it is process and ways in which people are not listened to, whether it's how we even think about regulating technology. It is time to really use a clean slate.
Thank you for both questions. I just wanted to speak briefly, particularly to your question, because some of what you talked about has been on my mind a lot. I'm from Minnesota. That's where I'm from. And we've had a lot of bad things happen in Minnesota regarding, the killing of George Floyd, and then also with recent violence that has happened in the state. And one of the things that I've been reflecting on is, to echo what Rohit has already said, is how can movements become a way to change, I guess, the political calculus of what is possible. And I kind of felt that firsthand in Minneapolis when I went back and we're looking at the changes that were happening in the community that, I was born and raised in this area, that were not possible or thought to even be feasible beforehand. Movements changed that, activism changed that, people saying that enough is enough, we will not let this happen. It created the opportunity for politicians to do something different because, quite frankly, there was more pressure from the outside. So this kind of anti-reformist reform can also be an effective, I think, tool. And it's kind of coming up for me again as I think about what's happening there. And so I really appreciate your question. I wanted to say that.
No, I just want trying to address a little bit your question. I think, well, the way I see at least my role, and I don't want to take us back to, everything is education and the human capital. We know that doesn't work. But I think in economics, the bar is so low that what my life basically has become, this just has to improve, because sadly, or maybe, I don't know, economics has become a discipline that actually put a lot of people in very important places in society. And not only that, we have policymakers that perhaps they didn't go through economics, but once they're there, they have to deal with the principles of economics. And for example, one thing that especially at IPP, for me, has become very important. We get so many policymakers that used to think that the cost and benefit analysis is just a neutral thing they use, right? That's how we should do. So, the question of you challenge that, if you challenge that mind, like, to challenge this neutrality in economics and in policymaking, for me, that's not minor, especially if you are in places where people that you're teaching would then go out and occupy very important places in a society. And I think what has been very positive is that there's a demand for it, right? What we get here, for example, are policymakers that, they literally say, I thought, I could do policy well, but then when I'm there, what have I been doing wrong? What's happening? So they do lack, maybe this is is not so ambitious, but I think there is something about how we do both. We remove this neutrality so policymakers really know what they're happening, even if they may feel powerless in a way, but at least they are not reinforcing that. But also, you're right, how we give them a sense that what is that reality, or at least the tools to think about that reality. Because I think in economics, what we do is literally stop the economists to think about reality, or they think through a modeling approach. So I think to get these students and tell them, look, especially something I've been doing with Damon, especially when it comes to what's that society, what is capitalism, is that can be a very broader discussion, but actually they are thirsty for that. Now we just have this Rethinking Capitalism module, which we thought policymakers would hate. And actually they said, no, that's what we want. Because you just can't understand what's happening here, and you have all these tools, so we need some more. So I think this is, I think that becomes quite important, and I'm going to just finish with the question of universality. I think what's happening, especially, that UK is my environment, is that the question of universality or internationalism has been a bit complicated. The question of the divide, the global south, are the global north thinking of the global south? Progressive economists in the global north, do they think about the global south? What's that? So I think there is a question, and perhaps to go back to your point of think about everyone, and what I'm saying as universalism or internationalism, how we start discussing these aspects in progressive circles, right? You're fine, you can study the labor market in the UK, inequality there, and you should be proud of that. But what's the internationalist aspect of that? I think policymakers also need that. So they don't feel guilty that they're not pronouncing Global South. They don't feel guilty for just be looking the labor market in the UK or the deprived workers in the UK. But then also they are able to contextualize that. So I know it's not very ambitious, but I think that's important.
Can I add one thing? Because I didn't answer this part. My own view is that lawmakers need to embrace the love of very simple, bright line laws. And the reason why is that as a lawmaker, you're supposed to represent the values. You're not supposed to necessarily, you decide when you need the technical expertise, but ultimately this is about human beings. And I worry that lawmakers get in a trap of saying, you know what, I think we should really restrict, call it whatever bad practice. And special interests say, well, what about these 62 scenarios? Does that count? So then you say, okay, I'll accommodate that and I'll create a complicated test. Then the industry says, this is so complicated. And then your constituents say, what is it that you even did? And it's a cycle of nothing getting accomplished with a lot of process and complexity. So I sometimes just think maybe we should be more comfortable acting like juries in the US, where a jury is impaneled, they weigh the evidence, and sometimes they're much smarter than the judge. They have their biases, but sometimes just one person has a lot of bias. And sometimes maybe we just need to say, no, we are going to ban artificial intelligence from infringing on copyright of songwriters and writers. We are going to ban tech companies from addicting youth without necessarily spelling it out in 200 pages of small text. I think there's more of that can be done to create more movement. Because when people don't understand what is being done, they can't really mobilize to support it.
So it sounds so paralyzing of what needs to be done. And this is why I love talking to young people, because they come up with crazy ideas. We always say that you cannot dismantle power structures in government, in academia. It's not going to happen. But perhaps you could dismantle power structures within fractals of those macro systems. So start with your small groups, start within the classroom, start within your companies, and really challenge power structures there. And what we're hoping is that this becomes a good virus that starts spreading out and starts infecting the larger macro systems. So I think that's one way of looking about how to solve this, because again, you come out of here and you feel so disillusioned. Like there's nothing we can do because the systems are just ossified and working against us. But we can start small, and I think that is much more realistic to try to accomplish.
And maybe we have round for another round of questions. So let's raise hands, and we'll take as many as we can.
Thank you very much. This is an incredible panel. The whole event is wonderful. My name is Jonathan London. I am currently the UNDP Senior Economic Advisor in Vietnam. I'm an American. I'm also a longtime professor of political economy. My first professor was Silvia Federici, who at the age of 19 wandered into a classroom, a philosophy course on self-determination and emancipation. And when you think about colonialism or anti-colonialism or anti-coloniality, I think that's fundamentally a part of the equation. The economy is a political practice. Colonialism is a political practice. Capitalism is a political practice. The unaccountability machine is a political practice. We have the best democracy that money can buy, as we like to say, in America. And I think that the object of decolonizing public administration has to be about that public purpose, has to be about empowering people, about self-determination and emancipation. And so coming from my position, and I am trying to help Vietnam develop dynamic capabilities, not claiming that I know the answers, but enjoying thinking about it. The question is, I think, for this panel and also for this organization, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, not private purpose, not colonial purpose, how you can support public organizations and public innovations that put people first, as we all, of course, share as a common value. And it's encouraging in this regard, and the question is coming, including the question mark, that the Institute, the IIPP is beginning this work, reaching out to places like Brazil and other places. And of course, we have the internal colonial dimensions as well in the United States, among others, where the financiers turned the U.S. housing market into yet another source of super profits. So the question is, for the panelists, how we can go about thinking about supporting public organizations in promoting anti-colonial or decolonizing purpose as a central goal, because although arguably it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, nonetheless we live within the world that we do, and we have to find a way to have public organizations that are accountable and that put people first. So a very open question, but thank you for bearing with me.
Hello. How do I follow that? I feel so out of my depth. So my name is Paul Fennell. I'm a humble practitioner in local government working with technology. I wanted to offer some reassurance to the panel member here around practical adoption of technology at the front line in social care, additional learning needs and other areas where we're actually seeing real benefits from responsible adoption of AI already. And I think we're doing it in the right way. I hope we are. But I've got a question for Rowan in a minute around regulation and the extent to which what you were saying about regulation can actually come to pass in terms of punitive outcomes for the people who get it wrong. So that's my first question really, is around what do they look like? Because multi-billion-dollar fines are the cost of doing business for some of these outfits, let's face it. My other question, and this is going to run the risk of white privilege whataboutism, so I'm going to acknowledge white cishet 55-year-old male from a privileged background. I've got some lived experience with exclusion through neurodiversity, but it's trivial compared to my privilege, and I acknowledge that. And what I want to say is in no way to dispute any of the points made by the panel, which have been fantastic. I just wonder whether there's a risk in Europe of us not looking to decolonialize things regionally and what that might mean for us politically. So as an example, down the road, Wales is arguably the first colony of what became the British Empire. It's yeah, Cornwall could well contest that with some justice, I think. Wales, though, I think is probably unarguably the world's first industrialised nation, based on the number of people that were employed in extraction rather than agriculture. And it also passed the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 10 years ago. However, in spite of being an enormous net recipient of EU funding, voted strongly for Brexit and had a strong UKIP vote. And I think that speaks to a disenfranchisement of its populace to do with an unvisited colonial aspect of its economic relationship to Britain and the British Empire. That's my conjecture anyway, and I'm prepared to be shot down in flames. So those two questions really around what does that punishment look like? Because I think the legislative framework in the US is ex post rather than ex ante and ex post, which we have in Europe and to an extent in China. So if people get things wrong, what do we have there that is actually going to make them not want to get things wrong? To me, it feels like incarceration and nothing short of that, but you may differ. So it's that, and does Europe ignore its own colonial challenges as its peril, notwithstanding all of the completely valid points already made? Thank you, and sorry for getting two questions in one.
My name's Colin Munsey. I'm Australian. I grew up watching Gunsmoke and Wagon Train and all that sort of stuff in Australia. And it was all about conquering the Wild West. And when we look at what happened, say, back in the 16th century in the UK, a lot of the history and the parliamentary activity was all about who owned the commons. And I'm thinking now, who owns the commons in the USA or anywhere else? How come Mark Zuckerberg owns the internet or Elon Musk owns outer space and he doesn't pay a license to anybody, so you can send a rocket to outer space and you don't pay a license to the government? You don't own anything. We get all these people on, the mad guy who's got the radio show in USA, I've forgotten his name now. There's all sorts of there's a couple of them, outrageous stuff. Something Wars, what is it? Star Wars, Info Wars, yeah. So how come he can broadcast? Is the Broadcasting Act gone now? In Australia, we had a Broadcasting Act, so you couldn't run a radio station without asking the government, can you do it? And if you did it wrongly, you lost your act and your ability to practice. So I kind of wonder what's happened to all the commons in the modern era. Suddenly private enterprise owns it all and the government doesn't have a say in what happens. And it may do, but that's the perception I've got at the moment. So it's an interesting question.
Thank you. Can you pass the microphone to the person right next to you?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, the panel. Sorry. Emilio, so my question is, do the panel think decolonizing this verse is a little bit backward looking? Because if we think decolonize or decolonization is part of the modernization, and decolonizing literally means undo colonization. After undo colonization, what's left for whatever area we are talking about? And we think colonization is part of the modernization, which we have to acknowledge that the whole modern world is based on a handful of Western ideologies that emerged in 15 and 16 countries and some European countries.
So I'm going to have to ask you to get to your question a little faster because we have 4 minutes.
Sorry. So yes, my question is do we not need to acknowledge that we are where we are? And the colonizing doesn't answer what after undo colonization. So maybe we need to kind of shift into a kind of post-colonization period discussion. That's my question. Thank you.
Where to start? I might try and pick up the, what about the left behind? As I am, the Spice Girl representing the global north here. And I think that there's a really interesting, and I wasn't going to swear earlier, but I shall swear now, just to in that one of the things that I try and bring to the teaching of process, but it's also praxis that we're trying to teach, is to know when it's inappropriate to try and bring an overlay to a place when actually what you really need to do is just sit and hear what the place has to say to you, and then think, what can I do in this space? And I remember doing a piece of development work many years ago, and I tell my students this all the time, we're talking about participatory scaffolding, when I was there to try and do an inquiry by design process with a developer working with the football club in Newcastle, and I was saying Newcastle, and they said, why don't you just fuck off back to London? And I went, fair. You know, what should I do in this situation? Because actually, is it anything to do with me, this? I'm here with skills, but I'm not here in perpetuity. And it profoundly informed my community and stakeholder praxis thereafter, which was always work with someone there in perpetuity. It's just a principle. You know, understand what it is to if I've got skills to share, they're not there to overlay, they're there to engage and learn from. Because there are no clean slates, and everyone has a story that they want to tell. I think that Hilary Cottam's work that she's been doing recently about work really speaks to that, which is she's going there and people are telling their stories. And we all want that to be said. Yeah, I'm moving now to the final thing, which is really, you know, this idea of colonizing practice starts in micro and then it just goes, it's like a string that you pull. And I really appreciate your point about moving to post-colonial things. So we can work to a sort of post-structuralist way, and just listening is part of that praxis.
30 seconds each.
Really? No, we're liking this. Okay, so I'm going to try to get your two questions together and then the left behind. I think we can get into the semantics, what is post-colonial or decolonial, but I think the point you're making is quite interesting, because when we are having this discussion in economics, the first thing we get, you guys want to go back to medieval ages, you know, and that's why for me it was so important to talk about Eurocentrism. Is a little bit along the lines why decolonizing economics? So we have to make the argument that has been colonized, as Demi was saying in a different context, and that colonized is the issue of Eurocentrism and how we understand reality, right? Who is saying to us what modernity is, what industrialization is, and how it happens. So it's not about going back to the medieval ages or deny the modernization. It's also the question, which modernization and for who? Because as if you look around, right, it's not that the entire world is actually modernizing. And actually, since the 1980s, inequality is just increasing, right? Now within countries and developed countries, which now we have this another pejorative term, which is, UK has become emerging economy or underdeveloped countries. The reality is, that's the thing with Eurocentrism. We have to challenge this concept of progress, of private property. Someone mentioned the commons. Because we are not in the creativity. Can we be creative? Can we think about development that is not in that terms of rationality, private property, and so on? So I think this is the challenge. And to join with what you said in a very specific terms, in terms of an institution, what that means. So for example, you're looking at Vietnam or so on. To me, what that means is we're not going to get the institutions that are seen as the best institutions as putting forward by the IMF, by the US, sorry, but you guys are paying an egg. And then they say, like, this is how Brazil has to do. This is how Vietnam needs to do. There's a very interesting economist in the US, Emma Labdin, she called hybrid institutions. So, of course, you can't deny capitalism. You can't deny institutions. But you can go to Vietnam and say, what is institutions for you? So there is how we've been doing now. Capitalism is there. And the hybrid institution trying to take in place what actually would be institutions for how they see the conception of a state. For example, if you look, I have to finish that now. If you have to finish the concept of African state, by default, most of people theorizing state in Africa, they're going to say is a violent state. Has never been our state. Right, so then the challenge is there's like what the state would look like in the African country. So I think that's the point. last point on left behinds. That's the best thing of my positionality in the UK. I can go everywhere as a Brazilian, and everybody loves that. So I was invited to go to Scotland. Yeah. Anyway, to talk about moving away from. But I think there is something that I find really. This regional and the decolonization, right? We had this in a workshop with someone from the island of White, who was saying this is just deprived area. And I want to talk about the colonization, but look what's happened here with the gentrification. And I think that's the point which I haven't answered, is the universal aspect, is how the problem is not that now everybody in the UK and Europe has to talk about the colonization, or is how we have a universal aspect. And yes, and that means that in the context of the UK, the priority, for example, in Island of White, it will be the gentrification of rich people moving there, obviously, which is also an outcome of the empire. Yeah. Sorry.
Maybe, Dave, do you have anything you would like to add quickly? Okay.
No, I don't finish.
Okay. Bye, Damon. Thank you.
I would be too long, but try to truncate it. My first degree is in economics. I'm a reformed investment banker who went into public theology. So the ideal of public has great meaning and great value. I was ultimately the founding director of something in America called the National Public Housing Museum, where we explore and redefine the meaning of public. And how do you return the sense of value to the public good? And so I would say, in my last 5 seconds, how about decolonizing the word public?
Everyone, please join me. Before we join me in thanking our amazing panel of speakers, I want to make sure that I mention, let's thank the sponsor of the workshops and this event series, UCL Grand Challenges, who gave us the funding and support, and also the IPP. And then also, let's do a round of applause for our amazing speaker panel tonight.